I think we should get going.
Onward and upward.
Onward and upward. So it's forward. All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the September 2018 Preservation Pub, sponsored by Preservation Works. Just a couple words about Preservation Works. It's a local nonprofit organization that advocates for historic preservation in Corvallis and Benton County through discovery, education, such as the Preservation Pub series, and stewardship. And your financial support helps the organization to realize its mission. So just keep that in mind. A couple of housekeeping things. First of all, I'm Larry Landis. I wear several hats. I'm a member of Preservation Works. I'm also chair of the Benton County Historic Resources Commission, and my day job is at OSU as head of the Special Collections and Archives Research Center. So I kind of am here in multiple roles, I guess you might say. A couple of housekeeping things. There will be a quiz at the end. You can't leave until you take it. There will be prizes too, so there's another incentive. And Ted also has another reason for you to stick around for the end. I won't step on your toes. You can tell that. The other thing that has nothing to do with historic preservation or anything else, but it has to do with the Old World Deli, and it has to do with me, because one of the yet other hats that I wear is as a musician. I play in a couple, well, 3 bands locally, 2 of which are playing here within the next 8 days. So the Beaver Country Hot Air Band, as many of you know, does an annual Oktoberfest gig right here on this stage. That is tomorrow night, 5:30. Be here, 5:30 to 7. We'll play your favorite polkas, and maybe some polkas that you've never heard and may never want to hear again. I don't know. Another band that I play in is the Hilltop Big Band, and we are kicking off our fall First Friday series here on this stage, October 5th, so a week from tomorrow. So that will be from 7:30 to 9-ish. We try to end up a little after 9. Both events are free. So what a deal is that? So I just wanted to mention that since I had the stage. It pertains to the Old World Deli here, so thanks. Some of you may have been present for Ted's presentation in May 2017 on the history of brewing in Corvallis, which was part of our local Historic Preservation Month activities. Wonderful presentation. And many of you, no doubt, have read one or more Ted's books. The Toledo Incident of 1925, Marie Loop, and his Peace Corps memoir, When British Honduras Became Belize. And many of you have probably attended, I know many of you have attended previous preservation pubs here over the past couple of years. But tonight's presentation is going to take a completely different tack. It's the result of many years of research by Ted, which started in his graduate school days, while he was studying physical education at OSU in the early 1970s. This presentation will include information about the physical facilities used by women's PE and athletics, so it does include an historic preservation angle. Many of the buildings housing those facilities still exist at OSU and are major contributing resources to our National Register district. Nearly a year ago, within the past year, Ted showed me an early draft of what he'll be presenting tonight. And as one who is, shall we say, deeply immersed in OSU's history, and have been for my 27 plus years at OSU, naturally this was of interest to me. It soon became clear that Ted was delving into an area that has received little attention and very little scholarship has been done on this, and has been underappreciated, and that's the early development of women's PE, intercollegiate athletics, and intramurals at Oregon State. The rich history of those threads can still be seen today in OSU's well-developed intramural program, the university's emphasis on physical fitness and well-being that we see in the facilities available to men and women at the Dixon Recreation Center. As some of you may know, one of OSU's signature areas in its mission statement is improving human health and wellness. So we have a long track record of that. And of course the other thread is OSU's women's intercollegiate athletics program. I think you will, as a result of this presentation, you will be able to see that there's a direct line from the early physical education classes of the 1890s to our top 10 women's basketball program. Take it away, Ted.
Great introduction. Well, got a lot of material to cover tonight, and so I'm going to be moving at a pretty good clip. I think if you get a little bit bogged down, just go with the flow. I will come up with some gem that will captivate your attention as we move on. There's just so much to cover. First of all, I want to clarify term physical culture and physical education. So, because not everybody will be, I want it so you say, oh, I understand what he's talking about. I use those terms interchangeably. Basically, physical education, or I should say physical culture, was the program up to about 1908. And then in 1908, the name of the physical education program was physical education. And so from 1908 on, the department became the Department of Physical Education. Also, for those of you that stick around to the end of the talk, in case it becomes labor and you run out of tomatoes, I'm going to tell a very special story about a secret society in the Women's Physical Education program that nobody knows about. But if you stick around, you'll find out about that right at the end of my talk. First of all, I'd like to give special thanks to Sylvia Moore and Pat Ingram, who's here tonight. Pat Ingram was the first director of the Women's Intercollegiate Athletic Department as Title IX came in, and the first department head was selected. She's the godmother of that back in 1973. And Astrid Hancock, who's sitting over here, who even predates Pat a little bit. She was in the program since 1963 through 1997, has done a tremendous amount of research lately in the Women's Physical Education Department and in the rowing whole program for years and years and more. Astrid's like pretty amazing lady, and she's sitting right over. Would you raise your hand, Astrid? So, hey Pat, would you raise your hand so we know where you're at? Okay, so now we begin the program. In January of '72, the Department of Men's Physical Education and the Department of Women's Physical Education was put together under a single department, and Dr. Charlotte Lambert was the head of that new department. At the time, I was living and working as a Peace Corps volunteer in Belize, and I had asked for information. My cousin who's sitting over here, would you put your hand up, Janet? I was having trouble getting through to Oregon State, wanting to go on to graduate work, and she came over here on her own from her teaching duties and got the admission stuff and sent it and made contact for me, and Dr. Lambert made room for me in the program. So when I finished the Peace Corps, I came up, and I was came in the fall of '73. And that September, I was up at the pre-faculty or preschool meeting with the PE faculty in PV Arboretum, and I met Pat Ingram here. There we is. She's sitting right there. And she came over and introduced herself and was sizing me up about volleyball. She had heard somewhere that I had done some volleyball in the Peace Corps, and then asked me when she felt confident enough if I would be the volleyball coach, which I accepted. And that was my love affair with the women's building. I spent lots of time there for 2 seasons. Here's some of the athletes I worked with. Marilyn Wilson, she lives over at the coast. Janice Baker, a graduate from Newport High School. Kathy Morris from the setter from the Willamette Valley here. And tonight's presentation, though, has a dedication more than my little part, and that is to Betty Lynn Thompson, the First Lady of Dance at Oregon State. Betty was an instructor and a professor, associate professor in the women's department longer than any other woman in the Oregon State's history from 1927 to 1972. And she taught all the dance classes at one time or another. She had square dance, tap dance, modern dance, social dance, basic rhythms, clogging, and did the whole enchilada. Betty published a book in 1933, Fundamentals of Rhythm and Dance. It was used in high schools and colleges across the country. She had a passion for ceramics also. In 1947, she was on a sabbatical and went up to the University of Washington and learned about doing ceramics, and bought a spin wheel and a furnace, and she made these ceramics and gave them to her professional students all through the years. They were coveted items. This one over here on the table, that was from the original mold. That is from 1947, is one that she gave to me, and that was very special. I first met Betty when Don Martin, well, I'm skipping around with names here. When the two departments were put together, from the men's department, Don Martin was given charge of giving activity classes, both in men's and women's. Kind of a shock at the time because everything got thrown together. And he told me I was going to be teaching a posture relaxation class, and I go, at the women's building, I go, okay. Goodness, what am I getting into? It turns out corrective posture classes had been around from the turn of the century, and they were very important in early physical education programs. Anyway, I go over to the women's building. It's one afternoon before the term, and Betty's digging around and pulling stuff out of one of the nooks in the front of the women's building, because she had just retired the year before and was told, Velda Bress told her to get her stuff out of the building. So she was in there poking around. I went, introduced myself, and we became immediate friends. When I found out that she had worked on this posture class from 1927, when the women's building first opened, and worked on the syllabus with the posture class, I immediately glommed onto that and asked her if she would be kind enough to come and maybe take over one of the classes. And she said, yeah, she would. She had no problem. She's 70 years old. And so the day of the class, it just so happens, the gods were with me. There was this professors from the University of Cairo visiting the Northwest, and they found out about the posture relaxation class, of the fame of it, I suppose, and asked if they could sit in on this class. So I asked Betty if she wouldn't, well, I had already asked Betty if she would come in and do a class for me. And she showed up for the class the day these professors show up. So I was kind of like feeling like I was dodging a bullet, because I thought, gosh. And so she shows up in a unitard pink one-piece suit and is leading the class through. They were mostly freshman girls still. They were red in the face through various exercises, and then flying across on the mats and showing the correct way to fall safely. And the Egyptians were impressed. And I was really happy that Betty was there. Well, one of Betty's dreams was to dance on her 85th birthday. And we didn't wait till number 85. Friends and got together, and we set up a party for her on her 83rd birthday, and she danced right here at the Old World Deli. This is before the brewery was here, and the stage was right up here. So you can see this part is this right here. And it was really, really sweet. We had friends from the community and well-wishers. They all came. 6 weeks later, Betty passed away at her home out at Oakshade Drive, and I was with her the night she passed away. It was very special memories, to say the least. Well, the story tonight begins in 1868, when the State Agricultural College it started for business in an old school building in downtown Corvallis. And here we have, and at that time the building was being shared with elementary and secondary and the college students. This would be some of the college students. You can see children out front. They were all taking classes in there. The location of that college, which the duration of the college was about 30 years, but the agricultural college was in it for 20 years, is located right here today. This is where City Hall is. See, there's Central Park. and this X would mark where the county courthouse is. So to give you an idea, we're at the Old World Deli, we're right in this spot. So that's where the college was located. So the next time you're by Central Park and you look over to City Hall, you say, oh, that was the original roots of Oregon Agricultural College. But in 1888, the college moved to its present location, and the first building was built with monies from the citizens of the county, and it was called the Administration Building. And that opened in September 1888, and students were being transferred over. It was kind of slow. The college wasn't quite ready for it. But this building, it had everything in it. It had the administration offices, a library, a chapel, a museum, space for 150 students. The following year, 3 buildings were built. And so let's see, people in the back half there, up on the 3rd floor, looking out that way, would have seen this picture, would have seen this site in 1890. These buildings had just gone up. This is a farm building called the Octagonal Barn, but more importantly are these two. This was a student boarding hall, and this would be in the library quad. So if you're looking out the back half of the library, this is the quad, and this would be over on the west side of it. And this mechanical arts building was about where the computer science building and Kidder Hall is today. And then, of course, the library today would be right over here. Here's a picture of the students. For the first 2 years, students either lived in town or up here in what became Alpha Hall. And before a men's dorm was built, this was a co-ed dorm. Can you imagine? Probably the first in the United States. And you can see there's all women down here sitting, and the guys are taking the rooms upstairs. This probably would have been, when this picture was taken in 1890, the total, probably the total student body. There wasn't many people there at that particular time, but it was growing fast, and the buildings were soon to roll in after that. So this picture of the women's dormitory, which is this one right here, and we're right in the front door here, was taken about 1890, and they had just built a tennis court, 1899, and I think in 1900 a croquet court, and right outside the women's building. And this gal's got a croquet mallet in her hand. What's kind of cool about this is, well, when did women take part in the Olympics, or when they were interested? I'm being a little bit silly here, but in 1900, the Olympic Games were held in Paris, France, and guess what 2 of the Olympic events were? Croquet and tennis. And the ladies had a croquet court and a tennis court out front. Doesn't mean anything other than kind of a funny coincidence. Here's the tennis court that's on the side of Alpha Hall. This is from about 1907. And the next year, or a year and a half later, the men's dorm was built, called Cawthorn Hall. Now, what makes Cawthorn interesting, and Cawthorn is what's today called Fairbanks Hall, just to the south of the women's building. How many are in tune of where I'm talking about? So you go to the women's building, so this would be the arts building, and at that time they had this big, empty, huge attic on top. When this opened up in early 1892, the men immediately, because this was the men's dorm, and they got out and left the women to Alpha Hall, they immediately started filling this up with gymnastics equipment. They had some of the stuff that was mentioned was everything, but trapeze and rings and mats and boxing gloves, and it was for the guys only. The first gym. So you could call that the first gym. But that was not to be the only gym. Things started happening right after that. The mechanical building doubled its size in 1893. So this right here, let's go back just for the heck of it. See this building here with the tower? And it's kind of small, because if you compare it with how it looks 3 years later, bingo, all this is added on. And a huge gymnasium was built down here. And that housed all of the athletic equipment, and the women used it, and the men used it. This is student use. It's all student motivated. So like the first football team, 1893, would have had all their athletic gear, and if there was any baseball equipment, there would have been baseball equipment. There was some showers in there. And we have an interesting picture Larry had dug up and put in his book, this great one, taken, and you see this door here, That's where we're at on this picture with these ladies. And in these days, this would be about 1896, the cadets, everybody had to be a cadet if you were a guy in those days, and the cadets would lead exercises with the women. This would be a standard look of a physical education class back at the turn of the century. And so this guy here, the cadet, was leading this class in this exhibition here, and this would have been standard procedure, and it was all for not for any college credit. That didn't come along and be a requirement for women until 1899. Unfortunately, that building, the mechanical building, burned down in September 1898. And that's all that was left. All the expensive equipment for the mechanical arts department, all the football and other sports equipment and everything was all history. How unfortunately though, there was a new gymnasium and armory already under construction that was going to open in 6 months. And that was today is the Gladys Valley Gymnastics Center. How many are familiar with that? Okay, that's the original gym that was built as a gym. And when it opened the following year, physical culture became a requirement for all women in the college. And in fact, I've got from the college catalog, they said that the place was built and was ready to go, and that now any woman that was, unless she had a doctor's excuse, had to take physical culture or physical education. One of the main attractions in the old gym was a bowling alley that was downstairs in this area. And let's see, the alley, yeah, here's a thing from the catalog. Physical culture, let's see, physical training. I want to just read the thing about the, God, I'm talking so fast, I'm jumping ahead here. Okay, new bowling alley at the Armory is quite a feature attraction. On both gentlemen's and ladies' days, the alleys are in constant use. It just shows how popular bowling was back in 1900. The following school year, like I said, the classes became required for women. Yeah, here's in the catalog how it was worded, the catalog from 1899 to 1900. Physical training has recently been introduced to the college course as a regular drill for all ladies who are not physically disabled, limited to the following exercises: free movement, dumbbells, clubs, fencing, bowling, and a variety of gymnastics games. The free movement they're referring to was called Swedish gymnastics. That's with the clubs in that and kind of calisthenic stuff, free movement, as opposed to the German gymnastics, which would be all of the gymnastics equipment, the heavy equipment that you would see in a gym. For that first year, they hired a man to teach the women physical culture, and he didn't work with the men's. In fact, they didn't call the men's physical culture that year. They called it the military drill. For the women, it was physical culture. And Mr. Leah, we've got a picture of him, was hired to teach physical culture to the ladies at the new gym. Now, what he did, there was a gal named Ellen Crawford, becomes a real important person in early physical education or physical culture. When she was first hired to teach at Oregon Agricultural College was about 3 years before, in 1896, as the elocution director of the college, meaning the speech teacher. She taught speech. But speech and physical culture for women was tied into the same department in 1899, and she was kind of a natural to buddy up with Mr. Leah, and she learned all of the basic stuff on the inside, things you would do in a gym. The warm-up exercises, how to use the different equipment, and the free activities, and she became like his assistant. The deal is, the following year, he quits, and she stays on as the physical culture instructor for the college for the next 6 years. And the kids just loved her. The men had their own thing, but again, it was under physical drill at that time before this physical education department came out. And when Leah dropped out, there was another guy they hired for about 3 years. His name was Patterson. He had a different title. He was the physical director of the college. And he had technically, I believe, the men and the women. Now, something that Mrs. Crawford didn't know was how to coach. And what was popular at that time was basketball. We'll come to that in future on here. Basketball and tennis and any other particular games. So he would have come into the classroom, and Leah would have done the same thing. Would have came into the classroom when they were ready to do team sports, and the men would have taught that. But she was doing all the, the regular gymnastics stuff. After 3 years, a famous man in Oregon State's in the men's department was W.O. Train. It was the physical, and he became the physical director and worked with Miss Crawford until 1907. Now, Crawford's endearment to the program was expressed in the yearbook, 1909, and this is what they said about her. It's safe to say that the wonderful health enjoyed by the girls of OAC is due in great measure to the physical culture drill which was received under the able instruction of Professor Helen Crawford. One of the most popular entertainments of the year were the exhibition drills given in the spring term by the Lady Physical Culture for people to enjoy springtime activities, and we've got one of her exhibitions that Crawford would have organized. So we're going to talk later on in the talk about the importance of the Spring Festival, which really took off about 1914, but it just shows that there was a tradition going right from the beginning at Oregon Agricultural College, Oregon State, of spring exhibitions and festivals. Years later, an alumnus, Mrs. McElfish, was interviewed like about 30 years later about her time as a student in 1898 through about 1902. And here's some comments she made. Physical education, she's talking about Crawford now, okay? It's time before 1906. She's talking about that experience. Physical education was taught in what is now the old women's old gym. There was no special teacher who taught physical education and nothing else. The instructor divided her time between gymnastics and physical education. The sports participation were in tennis and basketball. Women were instructed to play basketball by a man. Okay, so by 1907, the university had grown in numbers from about 100 in 1888 to over 400, or well, there was more than that. I think about, let's see, get accurate here. Cancel out the number, I just know it was about 1,100, going about 1,200. The problem was the gymnasium wasn't growing by itself. It was it was shrunk. And the first thing to go to make room, because remember, this gym was shared by men and women, became a big headache as the enrollment grew. And so the first thing to go was the bowling alleys. And Larry came up with this great diagram about a month ago. I was so happy he showed this to me. And here we have, this is the basement, and these are the 4 lanes in the bowling alley that the students were loving so much from 1900. And here's what was said in the biennial report about the bowling alleys. On account of the large number of students in the physical education, it's impossible to provide adequately for this work. In order to make the best possible use, the bowling alleys have been removed and the rooms provided with lockers for use for the women as a dressing room, and provided for men. More adequate provisions have been made for heating and water and blah 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 for about $1,200. Okay, in the fall of 1908, Helen Crawford had retired. She was gone, and out the door went the term physical culture. The new Department of Physical Education was set up for men and women, and a lady named Winifred Williams was really the first woman hired to do specifically. Crawford was the first physical woman educator to do physical culture, but Miss Williams was the first paid instructor. Probably got about $1,200 a year on a salary, I guess, something like that. And basic physical education class and format hadn't changed since the start of the century. Basically, it was all based on physical fitness. The gymnastics classes were also accompanied by rhythm with piano. So they had a piano down there on the gym floor, and they would get somebody to play to the rhythms when they're doing their fancy marching and whatever, swinging the batons. In 1909, they hired another lady to be on the staff because of demand, an expansion of classes. And also hygiene in 1909 was added to the curriculum. This became an important part. So I've already talked about the posture, the posture class thing. Proper posture was a big deal all through the U.S. Up through the first 40 years of the century, and hygiene was a big deal to be in the program too. Well, these ladies went along till 1911, and the program, like I said, hadn't really changed. Of course, there were the games they would play would be another added thing. The other thing I didn't mention was when the weather changed, people would get outside and they would do outside activities. You know, whether it was tennis or track and field was going to become popular up here real soon, as we're talking about that. Well, the next lady to hire that got on was Miriam Thayer, 1912 and 1917. She made a big difference, a big impact at the university. She actually developed the program into more of and added more professional courses to it. So she would say the modern physical education program at Oregon State was really was inspired by this lady. She wasn't only academic, but she was inspirational as well, and creative. One of her first problems she was dealing with was hygiene because of the problem of overcrowding in the gymnasium. She wrote a letter to the president right there in 1912 expressing some of the concerns she had. One of the things she said, many of the classes had 15 to 40 students, and one had 103 students, but they only had 11 showers available to the women, and there was a shortage of locker space. And here's her words in a letter she wrote. For 317 women enrolled in the department at present, there are only 86 lockers. These are not ventilated and are fitted with locks and keys of such cheap mechanism as to continually be out of order. The result is that 2 to 5 girls have to use a single locker, which is unbearably crowded with suits, shoes, and underclothing. Another problem she wrote in the same letter to the president was the difficulty in performing the job. Women's corrective classes. Now, if a young lady had to take a correctives class, it means that she didn't pass a physical, had some problems. First thing was posture, maybe rounded back or sway back, or problems with the legs, whatever, but couldn't participate in the regular gymnastics, so she would go to correctives. Correctives were generally smaller numbers of women, and the problem was because the gym was being used by the men so much, it gobbled up with 800 men in the program by that time, that these small classes of women couldn't reserve the whole gym just for a class of 6 to 8 or whatever the numbers. So they had to do the correctives during the men being on the floor, and they needed privacy. And here's how she worded that. The women's corrective classes were usually held at the same time that the men were on the floor. Not a single corrective class was held in privacy at the time. Space was limited. The co-eds would go to exercise in a corner of the gym or on a covered porch of the building or in the roof where there was a covered deck of about 15 square feet. Again, there was no apparatus available for them to use, like the racks on the wall to hang and do different stretching exercises. Well, the good news is that actually I missed one little thing. It was kind of a big thing. Was the building of the armory for the men. It was 1910. And the armory could be used for some overflow activities. They even had field hockey they would play. The women could play indoors there. Indoor baseball, a modified version of baseball with a huge ball and a stick. But more important was the men's gym at Langton Hall. That opened in 1914. That was super big because that meant the men left the women's gymnasium left the gymnasium, and the women could have that remodeled and used for the women's gym exclusively. 800 guys took off. that were enrolled in classes. So that left all these lockers and the showers, but it was yucky, sticky for 14 years of men using it. So the remodeling was a big on the deal. So what have we here? So she increased. So one of the other things she did when she came on board was she increased the requirement for physical culture, or physical education. The standard around the country at a good college would be 4 times a week for freshmen and sophomores. Here at Oregon State, because of the crunching in before the men left, they only had 2 classes a week, and that was not really acceptable. That was not. She said, "Hey, this is a classy university. I mean, not university, but agricultural college, and we can't even get close to the national standards." So she encouraged that be up to 3 classes a week, and then when the men's program moved to Langton Hall, she increased it to the 4 times a week. But more than that, Thayer also, during her 5 years, worked on professional classes. Even back in 1906-07, you'll find references to say, hey, there's a demand to know physical education if you're going to be a teacher. A lot of these people went into the teaching profession. And so if you can show that you have classes in physical education on your resume when you apply for a job, whether it's elementary or high school, that's going to be a plus for you. Well, Thayer went one step farther, and she incorporated working with children on campus and student teaching. And by 1915, I think there was huge demand in the recreation playground management area. And so in addition to teaching, other jobs were starting to become available. So Thayer, what she did, she got the children to come from the schools and come up, and they would have special professional classes for women that wanted to focus in physical education. And they'd work with the children here on campus. And she also saw that there was a problem with, I was just talking about the physical education minor that we did not have available. There was no thing set aside and say where you would find women enrolled in the vocational area, commerce, the School of Commerce, or the School of Pharmacy. So she went personally to the School of Vocation and said, look, I've got young ladies that want to have special training in physical education, but we can't get them a minor because they can't take the pre-required classes. And so she got them to say, yes, we will, if you recommend a student, we'll take them in. And what I'm talking about is the type of classes would be like anatomy, zoology, physics, and a whole plethora of other classes that would be needed on someone's resume when they graduate, and then they could have a minor in PE. So this is another reason I say she got the program at Oregon State to mature into a real program, other than just doing calisthenics and a few games. Well, the Spring Festival, I mentioned that there was already a tradition going back to the turn of the century of women in physical culture giving exhibitions and having fun with that in the springtime. But in 1913, the May Day pageants started up, and for about 2 or 3 years it was like, well, it stayed big for the next 20 plus years. But this would be, let's see, I had a couple of things I could read here. Beginning in 1913, the pageants, consisting of aesthetic dances on various themes, eventually become a part of Mother's Weekend. Helen Poling, who was taught at Oregon State in the women's program for a number of years, had this to say from an interview I had with her in 1974, and she's talking about 1918, 1917, about actually this time right here. Oh, this is down on the lower campus as they're having the May pageant. And Miss Thompson, Betty Lent, my friend, you met her. She used to go put on beautiful things down there. I have an older friend who I used to get together and talk with. She was a senior in 1916. She tells about when she was the Queen of the May, carrying this gauze scarf, and they were doing these dances, very aesthetic things. By 1921, hundreds of students were taking part in the May festivals, and they would have, the gals could sign up for classes in dance, and they would actually spend the whole term preparing for these activities that they would put on. And that went on for years and years and years. Well, wrapping Miriam Thayer's time up a little bit. Oh, that's Helen Poling there. I did put her up. And I have another picture. Well, yeah, she says some more cool stuff. That's right. She was talking about the wooden sidewalks. How did I get out of sequence here? Because I wasn't going fast enough. Let's back up. Years after that Professor Thayer left the program in 1917, she was interviewed by a student, and Betty Lynn, she gave me all her records on the history of the program, and I found that record of her being interviewed. So here's Thayer talking about what happened about 15 years earlier, 14 years earlier. This is a quote. "It's hard to realize," well, also as I read this, absorb what she says, because you see a reflection of the attitude of the women physical, the leaders at the time from the department. It kind of comes through. It's a pretty awesome quote. "It's hard to realize that 14 years ago, the Women's Physical Education Department accommodated the present enrollment of the college girls in the old gymnasium. Physical education classes were taught everywhere in the building, including the basement and the balconies. The type of physical education offered depended on the demand from the students. Ballet dancing was also taught, in which the girls seemed to be very interested. The intramural program, sponsored by the Physical Education Department, was wide and varied. Intercollegiate games were played with the University of Oregon and other neighboring colleges for 2 years, but were soon abandoned as the stress of the competition was not good for the girls' health." Sorry, Pat. It wasn't me that wrote it. "The Women's Physical Education Department on the Oregon State campus was very strong and absolutely independent of the men's physical education program. There was a 4-year service course offered for the majors in physical education. Graduates were then accredited to teach in Oregon, Washington, California." That's because of Professor Thayer making that possible. "Although the equipment was limited and the gymnasium undesirable, the interest for physical education on this campus did not wane." Okay, so that statement reflected Thayer's version of what women's physical education should be, and she wanted to raise the quality of women's physical education to that of other respected institutions in the United States. And to that end, she was successful. Well, then we come to this little story, the next story with Helen Poling. I think it's pretty cool. And this is getting off the topic a bit, but a little bit of the flavor I wanted to mix in. So in that interview I had with Helen in 1974, she was talking about what it was like to be a student taking a class in physical education in 1918. So this is a quote from that interview. "It wasn't like it is now. They'd give you until 7 after the hour to get out on the gym floor, and the class would run until 20 minutes before the hour. Then you would have that much time to get to your next class. Well, you just ran. There was just 20 minutes. You had to take a shower, get dressed, and get clear across campus in just 20 minutes. Well, you know, that was just not possible. So I would just ran up and in and put the towel under the shower and not even dry up." And then she changed the topic a little bit, and she said, "You know, in those days, in 1918, they had wooden sidewalks mainly. We didn't have it lovely like it is now, you know. There would be mud, and the girls all wore laced boots, you know. And I can remember going over to the Mines building where I took Spanish. Sometimes I'd just be shaky, you know, hurrying, trying to get there in on time. But then my second year I got smart. I got to play the piano. They didn't have paid musicians. This class from 1920, that's the piano that she was playing on. And so she would play rhythms for like gymnastics when it was required, or for the dancing movements, or whatever. And that's what Helen Poling. Years later, she taught at Oregon State, and she was an accompanist, especially for Betty Lynn for years in her classes. When Betty was on sabbatical, I mentioned about this ceramics stuff. In 1947, Helen was playing for some of Betty's dance majors, and this is Helen Poling here playing the piano. So that was in her bones. The next lady that was hired after Thayer to be the head of the Women's Physical Education Department was Mabel E. Lee. She was only there for 1 year. This lady became famous after this in the next for the next 60 years after she left Oregon State in the women's movement for physical education. But her year at Oregon State was a bit stifled. Yeah, the war was on. The gymnasium was taken away from the women and used as a barracks. The women were put in the basement of the home ec department over in Waldo Hall during Mabel, and so that was kind of her year. And in notes I had for Betty, she gave the excuse that she was kind of sick and had to quit, but I'm not so sure. I think she was disenchanted because she moved on pretty quick to Beloit College in Wisconsin and became a national leader. She was part of a very important conference with President Hoover's wife, Lou, in 1923 that set a standard for women's attitudes over the next, affected the programs for the next 40 years, you know, and they came up with a number of reasons why women should not be in intensive sports. But she was also very feisty and had some wonderful ideas. I'm going to read one quote when she was at Beloit that she made in 1925 in response partly to Hoover's conference that she had been, and also from resistance she met from the men's program there in I think it was Iowa. So this is her words. We propose to have athletics for women, for American women, but we propose to have them controlled by women, coached by women, chaperoned by women, officiated by women, trained by women, protected by women physicians. And we say to those men of America that are not concerned with ideals, men who would like to commercialize this growing force, those who seek notoriety through women's athletics, we say hands off. And we mean just what we say. In 1931, Mabel Lee was what today is the American Association of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation. It had a different acronym then. 1931, she was the first president of that association. The next woman to come to the following year, in 1919, was Edna Agnes Cox. She came from USC. She also brought the women's physical education fraternity, which she was very active, Delta Pi Kappa Honor Society, to Oregon State. That was kind of a big deal because I'll tell you a story later, coming back to the Delta Pi that Betty Lynn was involved with about 10 years later. She was popular with the students. She liked to get involved not only in academics but with the social life of the students. She expanded the variety of the electives and the theory classes. And like Thayer and Mabel Lee, she took the classical approach towards physical education, beginning with the physical exam at the start of the year to make sure the ladies were fit to take a class and also that they had proper posture. From 1924 and 25, she started taking silhouette pictures. This was not uncommon to Oregon State. This was done all around the U.S. But these posture pictures they'd take. Now what she did that was a little different than about 3 years later was she had them wear a tight-fitting bathing suit and then took these side shots, and then they would, you know, draw a line and you know, check the posture and see if make a program of correctives based on that, or move the lady on to the regular physical education class. This would be an example of a correctives class in 1925. Astor, that's called the rack?
Stall bars.
The what?
Stall bars.
Excuse me, stall bars. Yeah, these stall bars were standard equipment for correctives classes. Over the years, Cox received many testimonials from students about these posture classes. In fact, about 20 years ago, there was a lot of flack going on, a bunch of poo-poo. If you look in in the internet because they would take the pictures of the men and the women in the nude, but it was all kept within the department. But by the mid-90s, people were looking back to this stuff they were doing. I mean, men would swim in the nude in the men's gymnasium. I mean, that was kind of standard stuff from the 20s, like a good old boys thing in the 30s. But by the 1980s and 90s, and some of you will remember this, and I had needed to review, it was like, oh, it's such taboo. What were they doing? It was really bad. And maybe some of you feel that way, but all I can say is from my research that posture classes and the posture pictures, everything was really overall positive. Just think of it. If you have 100 people, whether it's guys or gals, and let's say they're 13 years old, and you had to put a bathing suit on, you take pictures, and you show it to them, I bet you a lot of them don't even know what they look like. And just that, psychologically, you know, they're going to start thinking, oh yeah. But that was only part of it. It was the whole program of strengthening yourself if you did have defects, of trying to work on and improve. So, interestingly enough, Cox also did more stuff she started in the secondary schools a program with teacher training. And in 1924, Harriet Moore, Larry Landis's nemesis, not nemesis, that's not the right word, his heroine, his hero, Sylvia Moore, and how many are familiar with that name? If you go onto the archive site that Larry has made into a monumental, one-of-a-kind site in the United States, I'm serious, one of the best we have, you're going to find Harriet's collection, which just has thousands and thousands of items. She was responsible for the modern archives coming to Oregon State, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. In 1924, she was a graduate of Mrs. Cox, and she had already had experience. She was older even at that time. You can imagine she does this years later. But she was asked by Mrs. Cox to stay on and develop a practical teaching class in the high schools and the elementary schools in Corvallis, which she established. She knew how to draw up the curriculum, and that was like a big deal. They had students who could go now and take a theory class and do practical teaching. In fact, they would, when they had their practical teaching experience, they would do that, and then one day a week they would go from the high school to the elementary school, and that would give them diversity as a student. You know, I mean, even today a lot of colleges don't have super duper programs like that going on. And of course, not all colleges are teacher colleges too. So the most significant contribution, though, that Mrs. Cox probably made was her contribution to the architect Benz and Herzog on the design of the Women's Building. She had an active input along with, you know, the Board of Regents and the President. I mean, this design was studied for quite a while before a final design was chosen. But Mrs. Cox had a big role in the functional part of it. During an interview I had with Jeanette Dixon, who taught at Oregon State from 1930 for a number of years, I went over to her house and had a lovely talk with her. Ironically, 3 months after I interviewed her in '74, she passed away. I couldn't believe that. So very fortunate to get her. And by the way, Larry has all these recordings on the archives now. Anyway, this is Jeanette Dixon talking about Mrs. Cox and her input. This was an unusual building in its way, and maybe some others have told you about Mrs. Cox, who helped design it. She was determined to have femininity within the profession. She wanted the building to be very ladylike in all ways. That is why we had our bathtubs and the shampoo bowls with hair dryers. This was her idea. She wasted a terrific lot of room as far as using space for teaching. This was a terrific waste of room, but everything was for the beauty. We used to have lights in the pool. They're there yet, but they don't work. Our swimming pool, our swimming show would be all underneath lighting and everything. I thought it was just elegant because I'd never seen anything like that before until I came out here. You know, there are a lot of lovely things in that building. It was much prettier than it is now. They made the rooms over and reconstructed the building 3 or 4 times. But when I came in 1930, it was beautiful, beautiful building, and everything was very plush as far as I was concerned for a women's physical education building, because I was just used to an old barn-like gym. I'll never forget my first impressions walking in there. A lot of girls who came boarded to school, boarded in housing with minimum bathroom facilities. So it was a convenience for these people to come here and use the facilities. But Cox, she did it beautifully, and she had this idea of womanness and having everything that would fit into education, both mental and physical. So Mrs. Cox retired in the spring of 1926 before the building was dedicated, and that's why we haven't really heard about her or known about her, because she was off the radar when the building was dedicated in February 27. For 1 year after Cox left, this lady, Florence Arendt, came, and she was the head of the women's department. She taught dance and was the leader, and I'm not sure why she only stayed 1 year. I do know Betty wrote in her notes that during the Giacoso Fun Fest, the physical education club put on this Fun Fest just for the women once every spring, and they would do activities and stunts in that. And she apparently had one of the teams or whatever on an exhibition at that time dress in sleeveless leotards and had colored, instead of the traditional black, had colored leggings or something. But anyway, for whatever reason, that made some people upset. They thought it was not appropriate. I mean, it wasn't very long till that kind of an outfit was very common, but she may have been ahead of her time on that. But for whatever reason, she moved on. And the next lady to show up is Ruth Glaslow, Director of Physical Education for Women. And that name, Glaslow, turns out, just like Mabel Lee, turns out after she leaves the college after 4 years, a national figure in national leader in women's physical education and research. Would have never known. She got really going, and a lot of research started right here in Corvallis, Oregon, our little agricultural college. And we get a big shot like Glasgow that we just had no idea about. Anyway, what did she do? Okay, so I'll jump off for that. So when she comes on in 1927, the physical education department now was in the new building. They had a lot of facilities. They were able to expand. They hired more people. And this is before the Depression. And they had a 4-year requirement now for any student going in, which meant not only your freshman and sophomore year with the basic PE program that they had right from the beginning, but now your junior and senior year you could take more electives, but the program was expanded. And the theory program was expanded. And because of that, about 70 women a year that went through the program went on to teach through Oregon and California in secondary schools. That was a lot, because I think there was, like, out of about 1,200 women a year enrolled in the program, 70 of them went on, and it was because of this emphasis they were giving during this time from 27 to 33. Also, during that time, and this is when my dear friend Betty Lynn came on, the freshmen were required to take a 3-term course which was developed by the faculty. And I'm saying this course went into a lot of detail. It was in the winter, spring, well, the winter, fall, the fall, winter, and spring terms, covered different aspects, which included the posture and the correctives, and it included the mechanics, and included fundamental skills and fundamental skills onto sports in the spring. The course, I think all through 1926, they worked on, and everybody had to teach a part of that course. And, well, yeah, it did begin with that posture picture, and I only bring that up again because they had changed the rules a little bit. They came up with a posture picture scale of 1 to 10, and on the scale was judged by three of the people in the program, and if you only got a 3, you had to take the correctives class. And they took pictures at that point in the nude, but they were done in silhouettes. And the negative, I mean, this was how the finished picture looked. It wasn't in the raw. It was that's how the development came out for the privacy. And that was done down here in the basement, or in the shower room downstairs in the women's building. In 1974, when I was making all these interviews, you guys won't find out about. You won't find out about that secret society. Okay. In 1974, when I was talking to Betty, we did a walkthrough of the women's building, and it was really pretty cool. It was her place. Anyway, we're walking down in this area, and she's saying, room 15 is where the posture room was, the big room where we had a camera and all facilities taking pictures. In those early days, we used to do all the developing. They never went downtown to be developed. That would be at Ball Studio, but they didn't go there. But some boys one year had a song going on, "If I could only have a posture picture of you." There was some popular song sung that same time, "If I could only have a posture picture of you," sung to that popular melody of the time. And she was laughing the whole time we're walking through there, about shaking her head about the song. On the third floor of the women's building, where the posture classes were held, there was one room called the measuring room. And it was used as a research lab and equipped with scales, stadiometer, that's, take your height, spirometer, I guess we're saying that, the one where you blow in for your lungs, and a hand finger strengthening dynamometer, and they had other apparatus for testing the heart, lungs, and motor reactions. This is significant what I'm saying, guys. This is 1926, 27. Physical education didn't really get out of posture and the physical fitness thing and move on to scientific research until about the 1960s. Here at Oregon State, we had a research lab in 26. Breaking news, and she encouraged her staff to do research. An example was, I found one reference where in the fall of 26, the building was open, it just hadn't been dedicated yet. They were doing testing on heart recovery rates following exercise. That sounds like Cooper's research in the 60s. When she resigned in 1930, she left for the University of Wisconsin. I'm talking about Glasgow. And she took this content that was developed by all the staff and her, and in 1932 published a book with that became famous became very popular in high schools and colleges throughout the United States. And in it, she had been doing research all along in kinesiology. People weren't doing research in kinesiology in 1926, it was like 1966 or 1960. But it turns out, when we start digging, she was an early researcher, and this is the book here. So if you go online and look, this is a copy she autographed and gave to Betty. And if you go online and do some research, you'll find out that this particular book is an underpin book for that any research done later on, years later, they refer back to stuff that was right out of here. So kudos to our wonderful Oregon State, and kudos to Miss Glaslow for being years and years ahead of her time. Yeah, during her tenure, she also added a lot of new activities to the program: clogging and tap dancing, canoeing, golf, table tennis, shuffleboard. And bowling was offered. The bowling alley on campus was gone, and the one in the EMU hadn't been built yet, so students would have to come downtown to 2nd Street, and there was an upstairs bowling alley down the street here. By the way, she stayed at the University of Wisconsin until 1964 and was still active in writing. Okay, now we're going to move back to the swimming program, because the swimming has an interesting history at Oregon State that goes back 110 years. And that starts with the YMCA building, which was built in 1908. It's called Shepherd Hall. Sorry guys, and this years ago was what KBVR building, and then today it's, help me, Larry. Today it's the Department of Speech and Communications. The first swimming pool was in the university, was in the basement of Shepherd Hall, and that opened officially for the women in 1909, and it was used recreationally for 3 years until 1912. These two ladies here, Helen Gilkey is a famous name on campus. One of her relatives, there's a building named after her, and she was a horticulturalist there for years. And her sister Beulah, they were students in they've been freshmen, 1903, freshmen in 1906. Well, Betty Lynn interviewed these ladies at their home back in the 60s, and I got my hands on that tape, which Larry has in his hands now. And I took some of that interview out, and here's what she said about Shepherd Hall. Betty asked, did you girls ever take swimming? And Beulah says, I don't think they taught swimming that soon. I know we used to go down there and go in. And Betty says, did you ever do any exercises in the water? Beulah says, no, we didn't have any supervision at all. Helen, she says, well, we lived 1 year next to Shepherd Hall in a house. One evening, 2 or 3 of us went over to have a swim. We put on bathing suits and bathrobes and ran across. As we got in, Coach Angel was just pulling a girl out of the pool. She had gone in and he said if he hadn't have got her, she had gone in 3 times, that she would have drowned. They all had, so they didn't have any supervision at that time. You could just go in when you wanted to and leave when you wanted to. And her sister, Beulah, says, that was kind of a weird arrangement, wasn't it? And Helen said, yeah, I jumped in with this bathrobe on just in time to save her. And then, what happens? Well, then Marion Thayer, who I already talked about, remember she came 1912 to 17. She started, when she first came, she immediately taught classes at the swimming pool. This is an early picture of inside the swimming pool. This here is the lone bathroom they had in it at one end. And you can see it was kind of a little bit scrungy in there. She wrote this about the swimming pool in the biennial report to the president and regents. The girls here are enthusiastic, willing, and anxious to learn. This is 1912, okay? But many girls cannot endure the conditions imposed by the present swimming room in the basement of Shepherd Hall, the YMCA building. It's not properly heated, lighted, or ventilated. The water's too cold for the majority of the girls, and the pool's entirely too small for the numbers using it. The 4 classes taught vary from 6 to 20 students. There are only 5 small dressing rooms. These have no drainage nor corridor outside. The whole place, in fact, is dark, cold, unsanitary, in spite of all that we can do to make it otherwise. Well, besides all that, they did remodel the place in 1917, and one of the, a longtime instructor, but a student in 1921 was, her name was Natalie Reichart. I also got a chance to interview her back in '74, and she was the championship swimmer that learned to swim in this tiny pool. And then when they started competition in 1918, she was a star who was whipping everybody down at the U of O. Anyway, I talked to Natalie, and here's her picture right here on that interview I said, and here's what she had to say about swimming in Shepherd Hall. Swimming classes were made up 2 for 1. If you missed a class, you had to make up 2 classes. The swimming classes were filled up, and it was difficult to get access to the pool at the time. So I liked swimming so much that I would miss a class on purpose so that I could get in more swimming time. Swimming costumes at the time were supplied by the college, but other physical education dress were supplied by the students themselves. Betty Lynn had, from a student, gotten her to do a report on the swimming pool. And this lady, Elvira Hollenbeck, her father was the custodian of Shepherd Hall swimming pool, and she wrote some really interesting stuff about that old pool. She said the pool was very much smaller than the one we use now, referring to the women's building. It was not equipped with modern filter system. Powdered chloride of lime was dumped in weekly, same as we do in the foot baths downstairs in the women's building today. The chloride was so strong at times that it was painful to the eyes of the swimmers. The dressing room was provided with benches along the walls before which curtains were hung that provided very little privacy or safety for the personal belongings. It was also used as a general meeting place. The showers were too few and not conveniently located for the best possible use, nor were they used very often before entering the pool, although I think there was a rule to that effect. Of course there was a rule. Why do we shower before we get in the pool? Let's see, I think. And this was a diagram that she drew up. I think she did this paper about 1936 or 7. But this is the only record we have of the downstairs swimming pool area. So you'd come down the stairs and there was a matron's office here. You could get towels. This dressing room was also used for a banquet room. And they put some curtains up here, and this is the dressing room. Then the girls would come out into the swimming pool area. That's the toilet I was pointing out from that picture looking this way. And then here's how hard it was. You had to go here and here and here to get up to the 4 showers with some benches, and then the swimming pool. And here's, okay, so that's the bathroom again. So we're looking, that picture's looking this way down to the bathroom area to give you a percent. And you can see how tiny it is. And then varsity swimming team came along. The first year in 1916, before they remodeled, the gals had what they could earn a golden pen, and they would have to learn different maneuvers in swimming, kind of like earning a badge, you know, in the Girl Scouts. And once you got through all those different, commanded all the different things, you would get this gold pin. The next year, the swimming competition started. And this is, again, this would have been 1916. This is before the remodel. And here we have the first year, this would have been 1918, the second competition against the U of O. This is Natalie Reichart, the lady that I interviewed, and she was a star. In fact, I would recommend, I hope the Women's Athletic Department puts her in the Hall of Fame because she should be there. So she just like outdid everybody in the speed swimming and the events and scored 10 points at that thing just herself. So she made a statement as a hero at Oregon Agricultural College. Now we're going to move on to the sports that women had in the first 25 years before they did away with competitive sports. And this great little chart here says it all. You can see that the sports were sparse, and there were some empty spots as we go along. We're going to actually, you're going to see pictures of all these teams I'm going to come up with in a minute here. But basketball was the first sport to come online in 1898, and the team was undefeated these first 3 years. And then you see no sports. Also the men, there were no sports those years. The Board of Regents were upset with the college because too many guys were getting beat up in football, and there was too much rowdiness going on. And they even laid a thing on the women's basketball that the crowd was being too rowdy here in Corvallis, which I'm going to read a report about that. Anyway, so that's why that break. Then the basketball goes on. In 1906 again, I think that was an academic thing where basketball wasn't allowed for whatever reason they could fantasize in their heads. And then it went on to 1908, and then there became this movement nationally, and also some sort of discord between schools, and basketball is off the boards for about 10 years. Tennis comes on and becomes very popular about 1913, and field hockey, the first field hockey game, you're going to see a picture of that, was 1915. This, you know what's cool about this 1915 thing with the field hockey is that it was the first field hockey on the West Coast played. It was with the U of O here on the lower campus. And swimming comes up, basketball, or baseball. Where's baseball? Baseball comes in 1922. Riflery was became popular in 22. And then this play day starts popping up. And that theme is going to come after 1925 as the standard until things changed in the 60s, and which led to Title IX. But was the end, so the mid-20s, you know, before I did this, a lot of us, and I thought it was like the mid-30s, and 34 was a real cutoff thing for recreation in the women's program. The one thing to remember though, this is competitive athletics against other schools. Oregon State did have a rich program in intramurals, inter-house all along. I mean, that was not lacking, so you've got to kind of balance out. This part gets people riled up, but the focus, even though it kind of went recreational, a rich program for all the gals was there. Just like in the men's intramural program, it was always, you know, sport for every guy, same thing as sport for every young lady. Now, to go, starting here in 1898, here we have the first basketball team. And some of you have seen that picture. I believe this picture, the athletic department has put a copy of that out on a postcard. The second year, same thing, undefeated team. I'm not sure how many games they played. There's only one recorded in the books, but I'm sure they had to have played more than that. And then the team of 1900, the infamous team that got chewed out for having rowdy fans here in Corvallis. What's interesting about this picture is that the men's athletic association, which was student-driven, that was organized back in 1892 to support men's football and baseball and sports. But they also, in the early days, all student-driven, and it wasn't until like 1897, I believe, something like that, that the faculty advisory board had to be included to keep an eye that the students were screwing up. And of course, I mean, the earlier teams, like baseball team of 1890, just played a game or two, but they had like from the club team in town playing with them, and so the advisory board would have been to try to stabilize and only college students. Excuse me, what I'm saying here is that the Men's Athletic Association took and embraced the women's new program with full love and financed the rewarding of these letters, sweaters, and emblems for these ladies. These are later became called the Orange-O, but at that time, this one here is a OAC on it. So this picture is significant for more than one reason. Also, I want to read to you WAA. Don't let me forget to talk about WAA. I can see the picture is not in line here. That's important. WAA, okay everybody, please? Okay, so to talk about this team here, their championship game that made them undefeated was written up in the barometer. So here we go. This is 1900. The most exciting game of basketball ever played in Corvallis was the one on May 4th between the YMCA team of Portland and our home team. Our team labored under more difficulty than ever before in its history. The YMCA team is composed of women greatly above the average in size, and the officials who were brought along with them were altogether one-sided in the decisions. The flu, which was prevalent, had attacked two of our best players, and for several days previous to the game, they were quite sick. As the result, they didn't play so well. The crowd witnessing the contest was very enthusiastic, and towards the close of the game, the excitement became so intense that they forgot themselves and, in spite of all precautions, cheered lustily. And that led to varsity sports being, in part, being shut down for the next 2 academic years. Wild times. Next basketball team of 03, beautiful picture. 04 women's basketball team. These teams, some of them were not undefeated. And what's interesting, we've got to say, this is 5 here, no 4, let's go up to 5. Now this team, for example, had 6 wins, 2 losses. Most of the teams they played, to use intercollegiate is the wrong term. That's why you hear me say varsity. Hi, Bart. Well, they actually played, well, like Willamette University and the U of O, but they would also play a lot of high schools to fill in the schedule. For example, this team here, they played Lebanon, Cottage Grove, Roseburg, Chemawa Native American School, but they had Albany College, Willamette University, like I said, and University of Oregon. The next undefeated team was the season of 1907. They also played Monmouth Teachers College and Willamette University that year. They played Monmouth twice. And then 1908, they had a 6-2 record. Now this is where something came up and screwed up the basketball for the next 10 years as far as inter-varsity competition was concerned. Helen Gelke, who I quoted earlier, had this to say, and it's about all I could dig up. She said competition was comparative with other schools, but one year the girls got into discord with some of the other schools, and so they discontinued the competitive teams. They still played basketball, but not with other schools. Well, inter-class competition filled in. The following year, 1909, one of the big competitions other than inter-house basketball was track and field, of all things. And the track and field competition was between the Residence Hall, which was Waldo Hall by 1909. Waldo opened in 1907. So Alpha Hall and then Waldo became the women's, which held a lot more gals. And the downtown residence, they called it the Downtown Girls. And in the spring of 1909, they advertised this. This is what we find in the yearbook, typical wonderful student stuff. Starting when the first rooster crows, that's the starting time. Anyway, they did the 100-yard dash, the 400 hurdles, they had high jump, broad jump, discus, shot put, hammer, and the relays. Anyway, the Downtown Girls won by 1 point, and that started a rivalry. The next year became like a big blow-up deal, and they got more excited and more people started working out for that. What makes the 1910 rivalry really cool is in the yearbook, there's a lot of photographs, and it's really, gives us a taste of the time. So here we can see how they made the homemade hurdles at the time, and the preferred way to jump over the hurdles. I believe the white is the Waldo Hall and the black is and of course, it's a good shot of how Bloomers could get over his hurdle. And then we have another picture, I think it's the high jump, yes. And they wouldn't let the men out, but they did let other animals out there. So, and I just love it because you can see the dress is still, hemline wasn't going to come up for another, 5 or 6 years. So it's just a great historical shot. And that was the start of, you might say, the start of intramurals, although this was inter-living, wasn't even inter-house, it was kind of inter-house. It was one living group against another living group. Okay, now we're into varsity sports, but for some reason, I didn't talk about the WAA. I need to do that because for those of you that are going to want to be a little more informed, that's important. Women's athletic teams. Okay, in 1892, a student athletic association organized by the men, I already talked about this, by the males, called the Oregon Agricultural College Athletic Association was formed. Baseball, football were on the horizon. Football was the big one. Dues collected from members contributed to the men's teams and to the women's basketball expenses beginning in 1898. The Corvallis Gazette reported in 1892 that the Athletic Association had about 150 members, and that at that time was out of a student body of over 280. So the students really supported this, and this early athletics, whether it be men or women, again, was student driven. It wasn't until the physical education department came in, they got their claws on it and directed. And in the case of the men went to the sports and the competitive thing, and the women veered off and went to the recreational movement. In 1914, well, in 1897 was about the time I had previously mentioned that the faculty committee got involved with it. It wasn't until 1905 that a woman was added to the athletic committee. But in 1914, and what was the big deal about 1914? The women had their own gymnasium, and they could build their own program, and they started their own athletic association. So 1914, WAA is a big, that was the acronym for Women's Athletic Association. The association was initially concerned with organizing field hockey and tennis competitions with the University of Oregon. There was a big palaver in 1910 after a football game with the U of O that was played here at our campus, and the students got in a big fight heading back to the train, and guys were stealing hats and beating up each other, and it turned so ugly that the students from U of O and Oregon Agriculture, along with the president of the school, said, hey, no more athletics for 2 years, moratorium. So the women were also stuck in the middle of that, and so by 1913, 14, the students were getting restless, say, hey, this is ridiculous, and we want to play our brothers down at the U of O. And so the U of O women reached out about playing tennis twice a year, and field hockey was right on its tail. So they organized the Athletic Association. And here's what the yearbook had to say the following year. The girls have their own branch of the Athletic Association at last, and are now in a position to have a system of athletics corresponding to other prominent institutions. Although it is still the policy to limit the amount of intercollegiate work for girls, yet the long coveted sweater, the college letters, the emblems, the orange O, will be awarded to the girls elected to varsity teams. Basketball games will still be kept on campus, but the most successful intercollegiate games have been established in field hockey, tennis, and in fact, OAC girls have developed the sport of field hockey to a new in the West, beyond all other colleges on the coast. The WAA was influential with the athletics. Oh, we're at an hour and a half. You guys are still here. Good. We're almost done, and then I'll get to that secret society. Okay. Anyway, the WAA was influential, but it wasn't autonomous, and the physical education part, that's where they started to become partners without any clear thing between them. And the very nature of competition was in conflict with the philosophy of the physical education department, which you got the feel from this talk tonight. Here's some of the excuses the physical education people use to try to stop intercollegiate sport. The aggressive nature of competition classed with ladylike behavior. It was believed that too much stressful activity could damage a woman's uterus. Too much stress could also lead to nervous breakdowns, and so on and so on. You know, guys making up great excuses. And from observations like this, the faculty and the institutional control of sports virtually shackled the development of women's competitive sports for decades to come. And it goes on. I'll get back to the last section, which is our teams, which here we have, starting up with the competitions against the U of O. And unfortunately, the picture was taken from the yearbook. I don't have a super duper one, but this is a historic picture because it represents the first women's hockey game played in the Pacific Northwest. And this is typical letter sweater with the orange O that the ladies would get. Field hockey team from 1916. And we have whoops, jumped ahead there, jump back, what? Don't make trouble for me. Basketball coach, I think I just got disoriented. Okay, so I mentioned earlier when I talked about Shepherd Hall, the swim team. So this varsity team, you have already seen this picture, but this was the first swim team that U of O had, that we had, and we went down and played U of O, and I believe they whipped us. But the following year, Natalie Reichardt comes up. You've already seen her in this picture, and she was the star of the show, and they just whipped the pants off the U of O. There she is. And she became an instructor for over 25 years at Oregon State. I just had a picture of the basketball coach in the following year. So here's the 1920 basketball champions. And they started playing women's baseball for a couple of years. And again, the varsity baseball team, that's for 2 years. Varsity women's team. And I mentioned earlier that riflery became a sport, and they competed with other colleges. And then 1924, we're back to swimming again, and basically U of O. And actually by this time, Langton Hall had already built their swimming pool in 1920. So these women and also classes would have been on a limited basis because the men were what they were, but the gals could go there. One of the problems using Langton Hall, how many know where Langton Hall is? One of the problems for that is that to get into the swimming pool, you have to go through the men's locker room. Well, the gals aren't going to go through the men's locker room, so they had to have a ladder in the swimming pool, so they would go into Langton Hall up to the second floor balcony, climb down the balcony to get into the pool. But they did have use of the pool. And then this thing shows up, which is a play day. The first play day that I could find was 1924. This becomes standard thing, play days and sports days. Clear up in through the 1950s, this was status quo. Teams would, maybe here at Oregon State, we'd have organize a play day, and Willamette University, University of Oregon, other schools would come, and they would, if it was a play day, it could be, I'm not sure in the 20s that they did it, but later Sylvia was telling me, you know, you would go and hand out colored cards to different people, and then from the different schools, and then the same colored cards, they'd get together and form that team, whether it's basketball or whatever. That'd be a play day. A sport day would be when a team comes down, like let's say the freshman basketball team, intramural champion, would go down to the U of O and they would play the freshman champion at U of O. That'd be like a sports day where the teams are staying always Oregon State and that. Okay, and we're finishing off by 1925. Whoa, Charlotte, God bless you. By 1925, it was the end of inter-school sports. And now, for those of you, I can see everyone is on the starting block, so I'm going to tell you about the Secret Society. Okay, this is from Betty Lynn's notes. And I've got all her notes. She was writing books till the time that she realized she wasn't going to be able to complete it because she was getting too old and had all this wonderful information stacked up. And this would be Larry thinking about it. I want to see that. Okay, so, no, that's not really true. Okay, here we go. This is what Betty Lynn wrote. From 1927 to 37, there existed a secret organization within the department called the WWW. This originated as a means of the physical education staff entertaining the graduate seniors of the department. Activities were limited to one weekend during the spring term when the staff invited the seniors to join them in a weekend of fun, usually at the coast. At a jolly initiation service, the seniors were made to realize that each one was now joining the organization Women of the Wide World. Thank you for your time, folks.